can you tell me about this event?
Okay,
Yeah.
so maybe let me give you 2 minutes of background on the Green Growth, on the Korean Green Growth Trust Fund.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a trust fund that's been around for about 5 years.
Yeah.
It started out with an initial $40 million allocation from the government of Korea.
Yeah.
And has expanded to about $88 million over 5 years. So it's a very large trust fund.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea is to use, from the point of view of the government of Korea, was to use these resources to influence the way that we at the World Bank do our projects with developing countries, to try to orient projects more towards green growth and sustainable development.
Okay.
As a result of the trust fund, we've leveraged the government of Korea as having an influence on something like 8 billion, I think it is, $8 billion worth of lending. $8 billion.
Almost 10 billion.
Almost $10 billion. Okay, so a significant amount of money that the government of Korea can influence towards more sustainable development and more green growth. And in general, in practical terms, the kinds of things that we've done have been of two sorts, I would say. One has been to work with the teams that prepare projects and help them adopt new methodologies, get new data, do things differently so that a project will be more green or will be more sustainable.
So you mean like finding some information or like
So I'll give you,
research,
I'll give you perhaps what I think is our most successful example and one that's really been very important. When you plan infrastructure, infrastructure is very long-lived, and typically what we've done when we design infrastructure, say roads, we've designed the roads for the climate, for the weather and the climate patterns of a particular place. So, the asphalt that you use is resistant to certain temperatures. The culverts on the side of the roads, the water exhaust things on the side of the roads, these are for particular patterns of rainfall. Now, with climate change, that has changed, right? And it gets a lot hotter, so the asphalt melts and the trucks can't go on. The roads get washed away because there's not enough drainage and things like that. So, and the bridges get washed away. So we have to think about how we design our roads, our ports, our airports, our bridges, so that they will last for the climate of the future. But the problem is we don't know how that future is going to be, right? Yeah. So we had to develop with many partners methodologies so that we could design resilient transport system in a situation with a lot of uncertainty about future climate. You see, for example, here in Korea, you have data over the last 100 years of the climate and weather patterns. And that's what engineers typically use to plan and design their infrastructure. But that's changing, right? Yeah. And we don't know how it's changing. So with the help of the Korean Green Growth Trust Fund, we developed methodologies and piloted them in a number of projects to understand how to plan under uncertainty, how to make solutions that are robust to lots of different futures, whether it's droughts or heat waves or floods or just intense rainfall. Okay? Yeah. So thanks to the Korean Green Growth Trust Fund, we've developed this methodology, and now all our transport programs are gradually adopting this, even the ones that don't get any money from the trust fund. Because with the trust fund, we developed the methodology, we piloted it, we tested it, and we demonstrated it. And now everybody wants to adopt it. Okay? So while we directly influence only $10 billion, $8 or $10 billion in lending, it has now completely transformed how our entire transport work is done. Also, how hydro planning is done, plan for hydroelectricity. Also, it's beginning to be done also for water and sanitation planning. and it's now beginning on power system planning.
Yeah.
So that's what the trust fund does, is to help us develop new methodologies, new ways of doing things, and demonstrate them. Because it's hard to get people to change the way they do things unless you've demonstrated that it's something that's not too expensive, there's a proven methodology, the clients like it, and then it works. So that's been really the beauty of this trust fund, is that it enables us to bring much more sustainable ways of doing things. Sometimes these are solutions that we bring from Korea, and sometimes we develop them separately, and sometimes we work together. So for example, we've partnered with Coty a lot to do the Korean. So that's one thing. This is one group of things we do with the Korean Trust Fund, which is to develop these methodology or help projects, do things differently. The other thing is knowledge exchange. And this particular week, we had representatives from 7, I think, Latin American countries who came here because they wanted to learn and exchange about how to do power system planning, how to improve energy efficiency, and they were also very interested in smart grid. So these are some of the things that where Korea has an interesting experience. At the same time, they were from Latin American countries, some of which also have interesting experience on other things like grid integration, a lot of solar, a lot of renewables. So they were able to share some things and bring some of their own experience.
Okay, very interesting. And then actually despite continuous organized effort of many countries try to have a solution about climate change, but these days there are some problems like Donald Trump withdrawal from Paris Accord, and then I think there are a lot of challenges about climate change project. So what do you think what is the biggest challenge about
Climate change?
Yeah, and then World Bank role in the climate change.
So climate change is a very important development issue, right? We're not interested in climate change because of the polar bear in the Arctic. We're interested in climate change because poor people and poor countries are going to be the ones that suffer most. At the same time, developing countries are a very critical part of the solution. Today, a majority of emissions are coming from developing countries. So yes, we need the United States and Europe and the rich countries to act, but we also need developing countries to grow differently. And this is where we need the sustainable development and greener growth. We need cleaner growth, and it is possible, we believe, to grow cleaner without growing slower, because developing countries absolutely need continued and rapid growth. The average income per capita in developing countries is $4,700. That's not a lot of money. So they need to continue growing. And the big question then is, how can we develop growth patterns that are cleaner and more resilient? We believe it's possible to do that. The IPCC, the International Panel for Climate Change, has told us that there's 4 broad categories of things that need to happen, right? One is decarbonizing electricity. Do you understand the idea of decarbonizing?
It's like electric car.
So decarbonizing electricity is the idea of being able to produce electricity without producing a lot of greenhouse gases. Okay? So one is decarbonizing the production of electricity, which could include renewable. It could also be carbon capture and storage. It could be these kinds of things. So number 1 is decarbonizing electricity. Number 2 is electrification. So things like electric cars, electrification. So moving away from fossil fuel powered cars to electric cars and things like that. The third thing is efficiency. There's a huge amount of waste right now. For example, 1/3 of the food produced in the world is wasted.
Yeah.
That uses a lot of energy, uses a lot of land, it leads to deforestation. We need to reduce waste, okay? The fourth thing is improving the natural carbon sinks. Those are the forests and the carbon sinks. So, you know, carbon is emitted in the atmosphere, and then trees absorb carbon, so they're a carbon sink. The ocean also absorbs carbon, it's a carbon sink, okay? So we need to help develop these and strengthen these carbon sinks by planting trees and preserving, you know, improving degraded land. So these are the four things. And so we're working in our developing country clients on all of these things, right? How to help them get greener electricity. You know, many of them have great potential for renewables, but then the challenge is, how do you integrate this into the grid? How do you make sure your electric grid is stable, even though you have, you know, maybe a day without sun or a day without wind? We also are at the beginning of thinking about what electric vehicles and self-driving cars and these kinds of things will mean for transportation and urbanization in developing countries. That, I think, is a huge there's a huge amount of uncertainty, but it's a very exciting time. Many developing countries don't yet have all the infrastructure built, so there's a potential for leapfrogging and maybe building cleaner in the first place.
Yeah. And then, like, first one, you said that there is like electricity without carbon.
Yeah. So decarbonizing electricity.
Does it include nuclear power?
So nuclear power is a complicated thing because it can be very expensive. A lot of recent attempts at building nuclear power plants have gone way over cost. It's a very controversial source of energy. We at the World Bank are not involved in nuclear energy. We don't have any expertise in it, but it is individual countries' choices how they develop their energy matrix.
Okay.
So what we work on are things like solar power, wind, geothermal, hydroelectricity. Those are the kinds of base clean energy that we work on, with a lot of interest for the fact that, you know, it's a little bit like telephones, right? In the old days, you had to build your telephone network, right? And then people who lived far from the network could not have access. And then you had mobile phones, which are deconcentrated solutions. And now what we're seeing with wind and solar is that it's opening up this completely new possibility of bypassing or leapfrogging away from building a traditional network. And it's opening possibilities for the rural populations that were impossible to envisage some years ago.
So World Bank is trying to, you know, build infrastructure which is pro environment and those kind of things.
Very much so, and what we hope to do is to be both pro environment and pro poor, because these deconcentrated solutions that aren't tied to a network are things that enable you to bring solutions that are often very well suited to poor people who may want a smaller production and who may live in remote rural areas where you're never going to have a network, you know, transmission cable, things like that.
Okay. So, but pro poor is not that familiar with me. So
Pro poor means good for poor people.
Yeah. So, but you can spend a lot of money for making this kind of infrastructure. I mean, usually country don't want to spend, you know, and the infrastructure for just few people. So World Bank is trying to support those kind of poor people? Or?
Yes, so we try to support poor countries and poor people.
Yeah.
Our mandate is to reduce poverty and promote shared prosperity and do that in a sustainable way.
Yeah.
So when we're doing infrastructure projects, we always look at the distributional impact. Some projects are perhaps more focused on growth, and then we say we're going to do growth and we're going to look at distributional impacts.
Okay.
Some projects are first and foremost focused on poor people, right?
Yeah.
So in a country where, say, we're working on the energy sector, we may say, look, we're going to have a project that's going to be about developing a transmission line so that we could have a concentrated solar power plant here to bring the energy to the centers of production so this country can have an industry.
Yeah.
Okay, you want that. That's necessary. In addition, we're going to have a project that looks at rural electrification. So electrification in rural areas, where we will look at solutions for what we call mini grids. So where you would have, let's say, a very small town that's far, or a village that's far away from the big transmission line, will have a little mini power plant, let's say, or solar power plant or something like that, and have a connection of, let's say, 200 houses. And maybe it's not a lot of electricity, enough to have a few lamp bulbs, a refrigerator, a radio, and maybe, one little machinery or something like that. But it enables the village to live completely differently. The children can study at night. They can improve on their crops, be more productive.
Okay.
They can have a refrigerator for vaccines. These are the kinds of things we work on.
Wow. And then there is the global poverty class has been reduced, but the gap between the rich and poor country still remains. In this kind of situation, was the role of World Bank, and then sustainable development.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the last 60 years has seen more progress in the human condition in terms of life expectancy, education, income growth than in the previous 1,000 years.
Yeah.
So there's been massive progress, and we're very proud and very happy that we have been a very small part, but a part of that. And what we want to do going forward is to continue working with the remaining people who remain poor. But again, I think over in the past, the idea was that you could grow first and clean up later. And that worked when France, Germany, the UK, the United States were doing that. During the Industrial Revolution, there was 1 billion people on the planet. Today, there's nearly 9 billion of us. So we can't grow the same way that we did then. Even Korea grew dirty first and then cleaned up. I mean, you cut out all these trees and then you had to replant them. And you're still struggling now with some of the growth patterns, right?
That's right.
And fixing all of that. So what we're trying to do now is, we've seen the poverty rates globally fall from about 45% to about 14-15%, which is wonderful.
Yeah.
But there's still a huge number of people, about 1 billion people who live on less than $1 or $1.50 a day. And there's also lots of people who are near poor, who are, at the mercy of one little shock and then fall down. There's also a lot of people that are very vulnerable to droughts and floods, and these have terrible consequences. So these are the things we want to work on, and we continue working on. But again, what we're trying to do is to find solutions that satisfy the 3 dimensions of sustainable development, right? Sustainable development is development that is sustainable from an economic point of view, from a social point of view, and from an environmental point of view. And our goal is to try to meet all these criteria at all time. again, depending on the country, will privilege different things. When we're talking about an extremely low-income country, say a very poor African countries where 5% of the population has access to electricity, we're not going to worry as much about bringing in the cleanest kind of electricity. We'll just try to bring what we can as quickly as possible, okay? Because that's always going to be better anyway than the diesel generator or the burning of the wood that's happening.
Yeah.
In the middle-income countries, in the sophisticated countries like Turkey, like Brazil, or in countries like that, then we're working with them to find very sophisticated solutions on renewable energy, on concentrated solar, on developing the transmission line, on power market regulation so that you can integrate this renewable energy. So we work differently depending on the country's needs.
Okay. How about the problem in the developed countries? I mean, like these days, even in the United States, there are a lot of poor people.
Indeed.
Yeah, I read an article, poor teenagers, teenage girls are selling their body because to get food, and then, boys selling just drugs. They spend whole their youth life for selling drugs and those kind of things, and they don't even have food to eat. So in the United States, so I mean, it was pretty shocking for me. So and then and also in Germany there is a lot of poor people these days. So it makes extreme right wings have won in election. So do you have any ideas about to solve those kind of problems in World Bank way? I mean, it's not. It cannot be. I mean, I don't have any specific idea about those kind of things, but I'm kind of curious. I mean, when I read those articles, I mean, how can these things happen in developed countries?
So we only work within developing countries, but in developing countries, like elsewhere, we believe that it's very important to address inequality. And we do a lot of work on helping them develop social safety nets, safety nets that make sure that everybody has a minimum amount of food, a minimum amount of income, is protected when, the head of household or the family loses work, or when things happen like a flood or a drought and everything gets destroyed. We've just seen recently all these hurricanes in the Caribbean and elsewhere. So those are the kinds of things we work on, but we do so in developing countries. But we believe everywhere in addressing inequality and making sure that people have equality of opportunity. We really believe in that idea of equality of opportunity. So we do a lot also on education reform and access to education.